Morning everyone, my name's Richard Keane. I lead the Innovation Legislation Education branch in our Biosecurity Strategy and Reform division. And as of 1 July, we're now Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, I should say, DAF, not DOR. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many lands on which we meet. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on, and for me in Canberra, it's the Ngunnawal people. I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. I extend that recognition to the traditional custodians of all other lands on which our staff and participants are gathered here today, as well as to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people attending today's event. I just sort of mentioned it before, but I'm grateful if everyone can keep their microphones on mute and cameras off. The webinar is being recorded. For those that can't make it here today, I want to go back through and have a look. So thank you to Chris Walker and the team. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of this presentation. If you have the capacity on your link there, you can either put your hand up or feel free to add in the questions as we go through, and we'll go back and go through those towards the end. Today's webinar is going to feature work undertaken by CEBRA. And for those that don't know, it's the Centre for Excellence for Biosecurity Risk Analysis. It's a long-standing biosecurity research initiative, and it plays a vital role in providing the Australian and New Zealand governments with expert biosecurity risk analysis and advice that helps inform a range of biosecurity risk management activities. And the webinar today is going to be about qualitative methods in performance evaluation, focusing on the use of evaluative rubrics. You should be able to see on your screen up there, Dr Arndt is going to run through that. But just to explain a bit more and to give a brief background, Dr Arndt is an alpine ecologist who's completed a PhD in alpine biogeochemistry at the University of Melbourne. Before joining CEBRA, Dr Arndt worked in the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning in Melbourne, working on various programs in forest fire management, including monitoring, evaluation and reporting on the effectiveness of bushfire management on public land. Having worked both in the public service and in academia, Dr Arndt is interested in the interface between research and policy, how scientists and decision makers can work together more effectively and increase the levels of research uptake in policy making. At the end of this presentation, I should flag from DAF, we're also going to have the Director of the Biosecurity Response and Reform Branch, Rick Centellis, join us for those questions and answers. So make sure you get those ready or plug them in as we go along. I'll hand over to the star of the show and let Dr Arndt get on with her presentation. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard, for the introduction and also for the opportunity to present this CEBRAnar today. And I would also like to thank Lisa, who communicated the flyer and the information around this event. And good morning to everyone. Thank you for your interest and for joining today. So today I would like to talk about I can't switch my screen. Okay. Today I would like to talk about rubrics. Rubrics are an exciting qualitative / semi-quantitative evaluation tool that might be of interest to different groups in the department. I'm saying qualitative / semi-quantitative because rubrics capture qualitative information, but the synthesis of that information is actually done in a quantitative way. So rubrics may be something that people want to include into their evaluation toolbox. And with my presentation today, I would like to raise awareness that this tool exists. And maybe at the end, people decide, yes, this is something that could be useful to them. But now I have to provide you with some context around all of that. And this is my presentation outline for today. I will start with a brief definition of what program evaluation is and its characteristics. Then I will talk about a specific CEBRA project, the health project. And this is the source of the material that I will present and talk about later in the presentation. Then I will talk about performance indicators, what they are and why people use them in an evaluation. And then I will get to the star of the presentation. I will talk about evaluative rubrics. We probably all agree that evaluation is an important aspect of managing any project or program, because program managers need to know how they are traveling, like they need the feedback to see how well their activities are achieving the intended outcomes. So first, the definition. Evaluation is the determination of merit, worth, and significance, and it usually involves applying systematic methods to address questions that people have about program operation and results. And the people that have these questions are obviously the program sponsors, other stakeholders, could be a minister, and the program managers themselves. So the main purpose of performance evaluation is to support strategic decision making. If people are interested in improving a program, or whether they need to select between different programs, or if they want to make a decision as to whether to continue or terminate a program, evaluation can inform that decision making. And evaluation outcomes also contribute to a broader evidence base of how interventions achieve outcomes, and it helps to resolve uncertainty. And as we know, public entities, public agencies undertake evaluation also because of their accountability requirements. So I've got some characteristics of performance evaluation here on the slide, and you can see that evaluation is usually done periodically and less regular than monitoring. And the timing of evaluation depends on the program. And the data that is usually used in an evaluation comes from monitoring activities. So evaluators have to deal with a lot of data. They have to manage that and make sense of it. And that's why evaluation needs dedicated resources for it to be successful. And there's a rule of thumb. I think I saw that in an OECD report that as a rule of thumb, 5 to 10% of your overall program budget should be spent on monitoring and evaluation activities. And at the end of an evaluation, you get a detailed evaluation report. The scope on this slide describes outcome evaluation, and outcome evaluation focuses on the outcomes and the impacts of a program. But there's also preemptive evaluations that can evaluate the effectiveness of future policy options, so prior to implementation, to identify the best one. And there's also something like formative and process evaluations, and they assess how well the implementation of a program is done. So that kind of evaluation looks at program delivery. So in Australia, we have the Public Governance, Performance and Accountability Act from 2013. And this act provides direction for government agencies in terms of what they need to do when it comes to measuring their performance. As we know, government agencies set out performance measures in corporate plans and in portfolio budget statements. And then government agencies report on their actual performance in annual reports, where they present performance statements. But these performance statements are really just about that, about annual reporting. There's no assessment of worth or merit. So that means there's actually a lack of longer-term evaluation. And this was noted in a report by the Joint Committee of Public Accounts and Audit in 2015. And I've got a snippet of that here. And that really tells us that there's not much evaluation being done. And it comes as no surprise that the IGAP review report in 2017 concluded that one reform area is actually knowledge management and system performance, and that there should be, I quote, increased capacity to measure and demonstrate the performance of the national biosecurity system. So around the same time, as the story goes, there was a senator in a Senate estimates hearing who asked a question. And he asked, in the face of multiple incursions, how healthy is the biosecurity system actually? And how confident can we be that it works? So as you can imagine, the signs were already on the horizon. And the department then in 2016 commissioned a CEBRA project, and it was named Evaluating the Health of Australia's Biosecurity System. And this project was led by Karen Schneider, and Karen and I worked on it over the course of multiple years. And as you can see here on the slide, the final report was published in June 2020. And you can find the report online on the CEBRA webpage. So the objective of that project was to develop a rigorous method and framework that can be used repeatedly to evaluate and report on the health or the performance of the national biosecurity system. So the emphasis is here on the national system. There were no examples anywhere in the literature that we could find where a biosecurity agency in Australia or around the world has evaluated the whole system. So that's why we started our project with undertaking literature reviews, 2 of them, and one was on evaluating complex systems, and the other one was on public sector performance evaluation in Australia and overseas. And these literature reviews informed the development of our suggested evaluation approach, which I can show you on the next slide. So our suggested evaluation approach consisted of 7 steps, and the CEBRA Health project addressed the first 4 steps because the other steps were too much to deal with at the time in adequate detail. I will run you through the 7 steps. So with any evaluation, the first step, a really important one, is to describe the system that you want to evaluate. So in our case, it was the biosecurity system. We would describe how the system is intended to work. So looking at its elements and the relationships between the elements. The second step is to formulate evaluation criteria, and we called them attributes of health. And we had 5 of them. There was effectiveness, efficiency, capacity/capability, resilience, and sustainability. So once you have got your evaluative criteria, you develop key evaluation questions that match to these criteria. And key evaluation questions are high-level questions that you want to answer with your evaluation. The next step then is to develop an indicator framework. You can select existing indicators, or you might have to develop new ones. And this is also the step where data analysis, or first data collection and then data analysis happens. There's also a point about performance benchmarks. So benchmarks are expectations of future performance, but that's actually a task for policymakers to set them. So we at the university felt this is not our place. This is a policy decision, and the regulator needs to define where the benchmarks are. The next step is a performance narrative, and this is about reporting your evaluation outcomes. You want to tell the performance story in a meaningful way. And then the last step is to close the loop, is feedback and learning. This is where you want to make sure that the evaluation outcomes actually support decision making where appropriate. And this also includes making any needed changes to the overall evaluation framework or maybe the set of indicators. Because evaluation is an iterative process. You don't get it right the first time. You might have to weed out some indicators that turned out not to be that useful. So the CEBRA work on this project provided a starting point for the department for how performance evaluation could be done. And the department is now developing an evaluation framework in collaboration with states and territories. And one of the reasons why I'm showing this diagram here is so that you know where the rubrics fit in, the topic of today's presentation. So the rubrics fit in here. This is the step where we select or develop indicators and where data collection happens. So what are performance indicators? Performance indicators are measurable characteristics of a program that can signify the level of success or the performance of management interventions. And because they can provide information and evidence that indicates success or failure of a program, they are important parts of any performance evaluation. But if no underlying conceptual framework, like a theory of change, a system description, a logic model, so all these terms are used interchangeably in the evaluation community. So if no underlying conceptual framework is used for developing your indicator framework, your evaluation might end up being biased and unreflective of actual performance. So it's really important to have an underlying conceptual framework. So data sources for indicators vary. The data can come from statistical resources. So for example, the Bureau of Statistics, or from departmental data repositories. Data can also come from reviewing reports and the academic literature. It can come from audits, from case studies, interviews, surveys, and focus groups. And you can use quantitative and qualitative data for your indicators, but a mixed methods approach is usually preferred because it helps you to weed out the limitations of each approach. So for example, if you have generated a hypothesis from qualitative work, you can test it with a quantitative approach. Or you might be able to explain unanticipated results that you get from your quantitative data with some qualitative data. Using a mixed methods approach helps to verify or reject results. So in this slide, I'm showing you the indicator framework that we developed in the CEBRA Health project. And this one is for the pre-border and the border activities. So our system description, our description of the biosecurity system identified 7 key activities that are undertaken in the system. And here on the screen, you can only see 3 of them for pre-border and border activities. But as you can see, we developed indicators for each of the different activities and at different levels. So we developed indicators of outputs, and we also developed qualitative and quantitative indicators of outcomes. And during that process of indicator development, we found out that it's actually relatively straightforward to develop quantitative indicators for measuring the effectiveness of these different activities, like anticipate, prevent, screen, and the other activities in the system, like prepare or respond, detect. But it's difficult to measure something like capacity or capability or resilience quantitatively. So we were investigating qualitative evaluation methods to actually do that. So this is a quick reminder of the strengths and the limitations of qualitative data. So first of all, qualitative data can be collected when quantitative data collection and analysis are not possible. And the most important point here is qualitative data can be really effective in understanding the processes that have led to a particular outcome. So for example, if statistical data analysis has identified a high leakage rate, a higher than usual leakage rate at a specific gateway, qualitative data can help you to identify the process that has caused it and give you more insight into the context of the problem. And analysis of qualitative data can also identify previously unknown issues. So qualitative data really helps you to understand observed outcomes as opposed to simply measuring them. But of course, there are some limitations. Qualitative data is context specific, so it's really difficult to generalize to other settings because you often have small sample sizes. So you might have only interviewed a small number of people. And another limitation is the subjective interpretation of results. Different researchers may interpret data differently. And participants that you have selected for your focus groups or interviews were often not selected randomly, which can introduce bias and make replication and verification of the results difficult. Qualitative data collection at times can be time-consuming and resource-intensive, but that really depends on the method. So, for example, focus groups, you really need highly trained facilitators to make them an effective tool. So finally, after all this introduction, I would like to introduce evaluative rubrics. Rubrics are a form of constructed measure, so they usually look like a table or a matrix. And rubrics enable evaluators to define quality and capture people's judgments, so the views of experts, in a robust, systematic, and consistent manner. And the term rubric originated in the education sector, and I think that's what we usually associate it with. We're thinking about teachers or university lecturers assessing student performance using a rubric. Not many people know this, but rubrics can also be used in program evaluation, in outcome evaluation, but also in preemptive evaluations. So there's actually a group in the department that has used rubrics to assess the effectiveness of different policy options before implementation. And this work was done as part of a regulation impact statement. But what is so special about rubrics? They are a really flexible tool. They work in any context. So we discovered them when we were looking for a tool for a method to evaluate performance at national level. But they work at any level. You can use them to evaluate the performance at program level, or you can use them to evaluate activities that are undertaken at division or branch or unit level. They don't require any technical expertise, just subject matter knowledge. And this is what rubrics usually look like. They consist of 3 elements. We've got evaluative criteria, performance standards, and then descriptors. So your evaluative criteria sit here in the first column, and these are the things, the elements that you think are the key contributors to performance, the dimensions of quality. Then over here we have got performance standards, and these are the benchmarks for evaluating performance, and they're usually organized on a spectrum from high to low. So you would have your highest performance standard, whatever you call that. If it's excellent or advanced, you would have this on the left-hand side. And down here, you end up with your lower standards, which might be called inadequate or poor. And a really important part of any rubric are the descriptors. And that's the text that defines the expected performance for each standard and criterion. So each of these cells will have their own specific description. And with your descriptors, you need to try to be as clear as possible. So the meaning is as unambiguous as is possible, so that people interpret the text the same way. That means the descriptors should be ideally developed by a group of subject matter experts. And yeah, ideally you have got a group and they're working on this together to really nail down these descriptors, to make them unambiguous and very clear and give little opportunity for misunderstandings. Because the quality of a rubric hinges on the quality of the descriptions, on the descriptors. If different assessors interpret them very differently, that would not be that good. So as part of the CEBRA Health project, we developed a bunch of rubrics. For the some of them were for the effectiveness of our 7 biosecurity activities across the continuum. And this is an example for a rubric that assesses the effectiveness of anticipate activities. So we can see the elements here. We've got our evaluative criteria, and the rubric for anticipate activities in our report has got more than 2 criteria, but I could not fit more on this slide, otherwise it would have become really hard to read. So I just picked 2 of them. And up here again, we've got our performance standards. We're starting with the best one here, advanced, and then we've got good, developing, and inadequate. But there should also always be a standard level of insufficient evidence. But I have not shown this in this rubric because of space issues. So you would use this if there is not enough evidence available to really determine performance. So just going through this example, we thought to effectively anticipate biosecurity risk, you need good environmental scanning and then also offshore surveillance coverage. So this criterion here is about environmental scanning, and under the advanced standard, we try to describe what does the best case look like? What's the highest expected level? How can we describe that? So we said this is environmental scanning is used systematically and rigorously across all risk areas, animal, plant, aquatic, and it is based on best practice techniques. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you see the inadequate performance standard. This is where environmental scanning is undertaken on an ad hoc basis. It does not cover all risk areas, and it does not use best practice techniques. And we did the same for offshore surveillance. So the advanced standard describes this as offshore surveillance has got an excellent coverage of priority pests and diseases. And we get a high level of confidence that offshore risks are identified. And then at the other end of the spectrum, all of these things are not happening. So as you can see, rubrics are really transparent. Everyone who sees this rubric can read what your understanding of advanced, good, developing, and inadequate is. And when you develop a rubric, you usually start to describe the highest standard and then the lowest standard, because they are the easier ones to do. And then once you've got those ones, you make the descriptors for the other standards for good and developing. So I've got another example here. This is a rubric that we developed for something that is not easy to describe in quantitative terms, organizational capability. And by organizational capability, I mean the influencing and enabling functions that underpin all or most activities across the system. So one aspect of organizational capability is strategic planning and policy development. So again, we've got our evaluative criteria, and in our report there's more than 2 of them, but I've picked these 2 again. And so we can see the first evaluative criteria was around whether there is a consistency of biosecurity strategies and biosecurity policies. And our advanced standard describes, yes, there is a consistency between strategy and policies, and they are harmonized across jurisdictions. And at the other end, doesn't look like that. And the second evaluative criteria was around engagement when policies are developed, and the advanced standard describes this as if it's done well, then it's stakeholders and the general public are engaged as valuable contributors, and all the collaborators as well. And the inadequate standard says that there's actually no process facilitating stakeholder engagement in biosecurity policy development. So the main goal for using a rubric is to get an overall rating of performance for something. So in this case, we want to get an overall rating of the performance of strategic planning and policy development activities. So what do you do first if you want to use the rubric to evaluate the performance of strategic planning and policy development? So your first step would be, so once you have developed your rubric, the first step then is to select a group of experts that you think have the necessary insight into the subject matter and provide them with a rubric each to fill in. And what they would do, they would look through the descriptors for each criterion and then select the one that they think describes the actual situation the best in their opinion. So you capture people's opinions on something. So in effect, your assessors would then select one rating per opinion, per criterion. So for example, they would select good up here, and they might select advanced for this criterion. So when you get the rubrics back from your experts, you will have a bunch of performance rating from individual assessors. But how do we get from individual ratings to an overall rating for strategic planning and policy development? Because that's what we're really interested in. We want to get this overall rating of performance. So there was actually no precedence in the literature that I could find on rubric synthesis. So how would you go about that? How would you synthesize all these individual ratings and opinions? There's papers and reports and books about rubrics in general, but yes, no one has really provided a methodology for how to synthesize all this information. So at CEBRA, we tried to develop a bit of a methodology for how you can go about this. And so you start with, because your assessors have picked a rating like advanced, good, developing, or inadequate, you associate these ratings with a score. So we would assign an advanced rating with a score of 4. We would assign good a score of 3, developing a score of 2, and inadequate a score of 1. And once you have done that, you end up with a table like that. So you've got a bunch of scores, and here again we have got our criteria in the first column, and then we've got our assessors across from assessor 1 over to assessor 8, and this is all their ratings that we have now translated into a score. So the next step for each row, we actually calculate this as a proportion of the maximum possible score. The maximum possible score that they can give or that we can have is 4. So you just divide the score in the spreadsheet by 4 to get to the proportion. So that means a value of 4 would be a proportion of 1, because 4 out of 4 is 1. Your score of 3 would have a proportion of 0.75 because you have divided 3 by 4. 2 would be a proportion of 0.5 and 1 would be a proportion of 0.2. And because the data is likely to be skewed and because we are working with proportions, we need to transform the data. So that's step number 2. And once we have done that, we can calculate a mean and confidence intervals around that. And then we have to back transform. So we get back to our proportions. And if we think it's valuable, we can apply some weighting. So if we think one of the criteria actually contributes more than the others to the overall performance, we can do that. Okay, so once we've gone through this, we end up with a mean for each of the criteria here. But that still doesn't give us an overall rating of performance. So what we need to do is we need to actually calculate a mean for all of the data. So I've done that here for the example numbers that I have used in the previous slide. So we would get an overall mean of 0.76, so the proportion of 0.76. And the next step, what you would do is then to compare this number to a grading system. And this is a grading system that's used in the education sector. So you have, you link up your performance rating with a range. And so the example that I've used here, the 0.76 would fit under the overall performance rating of good, because it falls within this range here. So the good thing of this approach is that you can use this aggregated rating of good, for example, but you can also present disaggregated results in your evaluation report. Because we've got them here. And these disaggregated results allow you to identify underperforming areas. So for example, if we look at criterion number 4, it has got a proportion of 0.46, which means if we go to our grading system, that would actually be a rating of inadequate. And criterion number 6 does not look much better. So this is how a rubric can actually inform your decision making, because they are able to pinpoint to weaknesses in a program. So we could look back at our program and say, okay, maybe this part didn't work that well. What can we do about this? And on my last slide for today, I have an example of how you can kind of further aggregate rubric results. An example is if you want to assess the resilience of the biosecurity system, you could do something like this. Use different rubrics, 5 different ones, and then come up with an overall performance rating. So in the CEBRA Health project, we identified the characteristics we expect from a resilient biosecurity system. And these characteristics were: the system needs to be aware, prepared, resourced, responsive, and adaptive. So you could have 5 rubrics, 1 for each of these characteristics of resilience. And then you might want to apply weightings if you think that would be valuable. And in the end, you would get an overall performance rating for system resilience. But as with the example before, if your overall performance rating for resilience seems to be low, or you think it's kind of too low, then you can dig deeper. You can look at, okay, which aspect of resilience might have not performed that well. And then you can also dig even deeper and have a look at what activities that make up your awareness, your system awareness, which of these activities might not have worked that well. So I hope this has demonstrated the utility of rubrics in performance evaluation. And I would like to thank you very much for your attention and hand back to Richard for facilitating the discussion today.
I can see a few claps going up there, so thank you, Dr. Arndt, for that exciting presentation. We've got a few hands up. I was going to ask you a question, but I will defer to the others in the first instance, and then I'm going to come back to you selfishly on a couple of things that we're working on, because I could see some really good application. Is that you, Kirsty? I'm going to go to you first.
Hi,
Kirsty Negs.
My mic's working? Yes. Hi, Christy here. Look, I'm just wondering if it's just a different, there's been a change in terms. This seems very much like multi-attribute utility theory, or MAUT as it's been. So the last time I wrote a paper on MAUT was about 15 years ago. So I'm very rusty, but it does seem quite similar. If there's a point of difference that you're aware of, can you please discuss? So I've come from a field, 15 years ago, I was working in transport security. So we had a mix of qualitative, quantitative information based, and I wrote a methodology paper on using MAUT in the system because it allows you to have context and whatnot. Just wondering also, sorry, second part of the question, and I apologize, I'm not feeling well, so my head's a bit scattered. When you were going to the synthesis stage and you were looking at all the different ratings from your experts, how you data clean, because I'm assuming you have to do some sort of data cleaning in there, and this becomes problematic when you've got different experts with different personalities that are viewing things very different, particularly in the qualitative space. You know, one gets a 6, the other one gets a 1. What do you do? Would you disregard that? And also, would you have to put a note that you've disregarded the qualitative data? Thank you.
No worries. I might start with your first part. That was around multi-utility theory, whether the rubrics are something similar. Is that right? Was that your question?
Multi-attribute utility theory,
or
MAUT, as it was called. Because you do weightings with that as well, and you...
Yeah, I have to admit, I have not heard about this, but I will definitely look it up. So I'm not sure about the similarities then to the rubrics approach.
I'm just wondering whether one of the reasons you couldn't find the literature is because that was the terminology that's used in that kind of social science space as you merge. Because this is a real issue when we try to do hybrid models for what works, and we're kind of at that stage is there's often different language, so there's different titles.
Yeah, no, I have not come across this at all. So that I will be very interested to read a bit more about that. And the second part of your question was about the data cleaning. What do you do if different assessors give wildly different ratings? So if you would disregard them, I'm not sure. I think the thing to do would be to try and improve your rubric, because I think if there's really a vast range and you've got people that are at either end of the spectrum, that just shows you that there might be something in the descriptors that hasn't really worked that well, that they have misinterpreted or misunderstood what you have described.
So you'd say go back to them and reconfirm their responses. I think in the space that I operate in, we have a political overlay which comes in as well. So it then becomes very subjective.
Yeah, and Andrew just pointed out you can report the standard deviation. So I think that's another thing you can do. And yes, I think it's definitely worth following up. I wouldn't exclude these judgments. It's just a signal for further investigation. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Christy. Food for thought there, and apologies for getting your name wrong before. I'm going to hold off on Chris Walk's question there, but we've just got a couple of others coming through, Dr. Arndt. So I'll read out this one. This is from Marion Blake, so feel free to add in anything, Marion, afterwards. But how many subject matter expert scorers do you need to make the information valid? Also, if the subject matter experts are the ones that manage the policy, do you think they will score themselves higher? I know I would do that, but you know.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know what's the exact number that you need, but I would try and get, I don't know, at least 5 to 10 people. Like, the more heads, the better, I guess. I guess not always, but I think a good discussion around them and testing and all that. Yeah, so the group shouldn't be too small of your subject matter experts. Yes, I think I can see the problem there. The people who have developed the rubrics then sort of judging themselves, that might be an issue, because we were looking at this method to be used to evaluate the national system. So I think on a higher level it probably works better, because you will have more subject matter experts that have got an opinion on how things are going in the system. If you're working on a smaller level, that there might be an issue with, yeah. You're sort of judging yourself, but I think because it's transparent, you're very clear about what the different levels of performance are, and that's the beauty of it. There's not a black box that spits out a result. You know exactly where it came from and what the expectations were, the performance expectations. So it doesn't hide anything. So I think that's a strength. It's yeah.
Great, thank you.
That's a really good point being raised, because we all have natural bias in the way that we either work or how we live. So as long as those sorts of things are documented. But just noting that I think Rick Centellis is online as well. And Rick, just particularly interested on this sort of subject there around whether the rubrics and this sort of approach is widely used. I mean, I know we've had some discussions around how they could be used for even baselining new activities and getting stakeholders to provide input to get a base measurement and then build from there. But just wondering if there's anything else you'd like to elaborate. So everyone, this is Rick Centellis.
Okay, thanks, Rich. So hello to everyone. So I'm running the Biosecurity Evaluation and Performance Coordination area within BSRD. So, you know, the bottom line for us is it's evidence-based policy that we need. So we need information and evidence in terms of how we make decisions. We need to be able to evaluate whether our interventions and our policy levers actually are achieving our objectives. And there's a number of ways of collecting information. You know, there's rubrics, there's talking to stakeholders, there's focus groups, there's a whole heap of things. What I will say in relation to the work I'm doing at the moment, so I'm starting to pull together performance evaluation metrics for the national biosecurity system. So that's ourselves plus the states and territories. You know, there's a number of complexities in there relating to state, territory, Commonwealth relationships. There's complexities relating to the resourcing and the ability to do a rubric. There's complexities related to what people are prepared to share and not share. So it's, you know, shining a light on things that they may not want things to be uncovered or highlighted. And there's always the Commonwealth has the money. You know, in this space with the national system, one of the difficulties we do have is our focus is different to the states and territories in terms of where we're going. Biosecurity for them includes feral management, whereas for us, once it's established, it's not really a problem for us. And the real difficulty is, if you take our utopian goal, it's zero. There are zero incursions, there are zero incidents to manage. Then you're nearly looking at a counterfactual measure of a metric to actually get there. So, you know, how many interventions do you get at the border? Does that tell you anything about your utopian goal? Yes, no. We may miss something and it may die a natural death somewhere, or vice versa, it may not. The layers are multifaceted, so whether you need to have an advanced tick at every point, I don't know. And also it depends on the vector in the system. So at the moment, if you haven't seen the departments focusing on foot and mouth, you've probably been asleep for a couple of weeks. But that's a different set of policy levers compared to what we're trying to do to deliver appropriate level of protections for Australia in the biosecurity sense. So this is just one input that can be used for the policy levers. Definitely for the evaluation, you need to have the ability to say, we have done this, was it effective, how can we do it better in the future? So there's an element of adaptive management that leads to, but to me, it's an input of a broader system of inputs and how you do it, noting the difficulties that can occur in the state territory space.
Thanks, Rick. And I guess you probably can't say too much, but I know there's also that additional layer of scrutiny when we talk about, let's just say IGB or the ANAO in terms of what are the approaches that you're looking to do. And as long as you can sort of at least provide the methodology and the reasoning, some of it might be quantitative versus qualitative, but going through. But Dr. Arndt, I really like the rubric approach. I think it's a good way of being able to document and even baseline activities. So, but there's a number of other questions here. So sorry, I'm going to try and get through a few here if we can. And this is from Bet Bosibori in terms of indicator framework. What guides you to decide whether you would develop a new indicator framework or whether you could use an existing one? And would this be dependent on existing literature?
Yes. So the question was more around using existing indicators, not the framework for the indicators, or not the overall framework. I think a framework, an evaluation framework, will always need to be custom made for that particular evaluation. But you might have indicators that have been already used in previous evaluations, or there are some indicators that are really obvious and really good that you can use, and you can select them. But then I guess you will need to do more. That's where you develop new indicators, and that's where the literature can help. But that's where we kind of hit the wall a bit, because we were really struggling to find any examples of biosecurity agencies overseas that have done a whole system evaluation, or in Australia as well. So I think that's where we had to almost start at point zero with everything to bring that evaluation up to national level. Yeah. That hasn't been done before in a way where we can actually access any of the. If it has been done, we couldn't see it. Yeah.
Thanks very much, and I think that also just goes back to I'm just trying to find the top of the questions there for Chris Walk, where he was just sort of flagging, have we looked at international development assistance examples in terms of complex program logic, monitoring and evaluation, theory of change and estimating value for money. So happy for you two to fight over who wants to respond, or you can both respond. I'm easy.
I might hand it over to Rick if that's okay.
No pressure, Rick.
You're still on mute.
It's probably the best way you want to hear me, on mute. I think one of the interesting things in the biosecurity space is, other than ourselves in New Zealand, the biosecurity systems worldwide are generally pretty poor. You travel from Europe, you can go north to south, east to west, and not be checked for anything. Similarly in North America and Africa and South America. So there's not really a benchmark for us to compare against other than ourselves, and possibly some lessons learnt from the past of, we didn't do this and this happened. So I think it's a really tricky space to look at how we're going that way. You know, the measure of evaluation and effectiveness at one level, there's a political layer to it, and yeah, regardless of what we do, if there is an outbreak of foot and mouth disease, will we regard it as failing? You know, and I think that's a really hard reality and a metric to come by when our entire paradigm is appropriate level of protection. You know, our paradigm isn't zero, and the way we're structured is we're geared to respond, we're geared to fix if our first number of layers don't stop the nasty at the border. But I think the reality is, and Rich, I think, you know, you'd agree with me that if we had an outbreak of FMD, we'd be in a world of hurt in the media as much as we would be in terms of the country. Does that answer people's questions in that space?
I think it does. I mean, Rick, it's a very challenging question and response. You know, we have to fight between, you know, the lawful and orderly flow of people and goods across the border and the commercial challenges associated with that, as well as trying to have zero outbreaks or zero sort of biosecurity threats and risks sort of manifest in Australia and New Zealand. We are lucky in that we are island countries, so I guess we do have those benefits there, but there is a lot of challenges with that. And I think there was just a couple of other people also flagging some of the challenges around also data and metrics in order to be able to evaluate and look at performance there. So look, there's a lot that we could go through. I just want to thank Rick in particular and Dr. Arndt for their time today. We've got a lot of questions out there. This is recorded. We will make sure that any other information we can send out, I know Chris will be onto that. But if I can just ask everyone to put their hands together, and thank you very much for our two co-presenters today for their time. It's much appreciated.